Second Lieutenant Han Waiguo carried a notebook the way some men carried a photograph, because it was the only thing that still made sense to him. On the night of February 16, 1951, 3 days after his company had been thrown against a horseshoe of frozen rice paddies around a South Korean crossroads town called Chipyong-ni, he sat against the wall of a farmhouse 11 miles north of the line and wrote by the light of a hooded lamp. We were told the Americans do not fight at night, that they cannot stand the cold, that they break when surrounded. I have now seen all 3 claims tested against a village the size of my own hometown, and I have watched all 3 claims die in the snow with my men. That sentence, half confession, half indictment, would sit inside Han's notebook for 30 years before anyone outside his family read it. This is not the version of Chipyong-ni that ends in a clean American victory montage. This is the version written from the losing side of the wire, by the men who walked into it certain and walked out of it, the ones who walked out changed. Han was 26 years old that February, and he had not come to Korea a green soldier. He had fought the Japanese in Shandong province as a teenager, running messages between village cells before he was old enough to carry a rifle. By 1948, he was a platoon leader in the Chinese Civil War, and he had gone through the brutal reduction of nationalist positions around Jinan with a reputation, among the men who served with him, for a kind of icy patience under fire. When the order came in October 1950 to cross the Yalu as a volunteer, the fiction the Chinese government maintained, even as entire armies marched south, Han was considered one of the more seasoned junior officers in his division. He had beaten American and South Korean forces before at Unsan, at the Changchun, in the chaos of the retreat that followed. He believed, as most of his army believed by January 1951, that the war was already decided and that what remained was mopping up. This is important because the credibility of what Han wrote afterward rests on the fact that he was not a frightened conscript encountering combat for the first time. He was a veteran of 2 wars, a man who had already watched American units collapse under pressure once that winter, at the Changchun and later at Hongsong, barely a week before Chipyong-ni, where 2 U.S. divisions had been mauled badly enough that the road south was, for a few days, littered with abandoned vehicles the Chinese called, in their own dry battlefield slang, the Gift Road. Han's notebook does not read like a man predisposed to be impressed by American soldiers. That is exactly why what it says about Chipyong-ni carries weight. To understand what he was walking into, you have to understand what the 23rd Regimental Combat Team was built to be, and what it had been built to survive. The 23rd Infantry Regiment was not an elite formation in the way the Marines or the airborne divisions were elite. It was a regular Army regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division, built and rebuilt across 3 wars, and by late 1950 it had already been bled once in Korea, mauled badly enough at the Changchun River in November that some officers privately wondered whether it could be trusted to hold a defensive line again. Command of the regiment had passed, that autumn, to a West Point colonel named Paul L. Freeman, Jr. A quiet, exacting officer who had a reputation among his staff for demanding that positions be dug deep enough to survive artillery, not just deep enough to pass inspection. Freeman's philosophy, as his junior officers would later describe it, was almost stubbornly simple. A perimeter that could not be flanked was worth more than ground that could not be held. It was a philosophy that had nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with arithmetic: how many men, how much ammunition, how tight a ring. Attached to Freeman's regiment was something unusual for the U.S. Army, a battalion of French volunteers, 800 strong, commanded by a 58-year-old lieutenant colonel who had once been a 3-star general and had voluntarily taken a demotion of 2 full ranks so that he could lead troops in the field again. His men, drawn from the French Foreign Legion and from metropolitan France alike, brought with them a taste for the bayonet charge that startled the Americans who fought beside them, and improbably, a hand-cranked air raid siren that would, in the battle to come, become a small piece of psychological warfare all its own. By February 3, 1951, the 23rd RCT had reached the crossroads town of Chipyong-ni, a huddle of thatched-roof houses in a valley ringed by low hills, 40 miles east of Seoul, sitting on top of roads that mattered more than the town itself. Freeman did not have enough men to hold the high ground surrounding the valley. A continuous ring across those hills would have needed a division, and he had barely a regiment. So he made the harder choice, a tight perimeter around the village itself, artillery zeroed on every approach, 10 days to dig before the enemy arrived. His men joked bitterly that they were digging their own graves. They did not yet know how close and how wrong that joke would come to being literally true, and then, against every expectation on either side of the line, how wrong it would turn out to be in the other direction entirely. Han's division was one of 5 that would eventually be thrown at that perimeter, drawn from at least 3 different Chinese armies, a scale of force so large that American intelligence, even after the battle, struggled to reconstruct exactly which units had taken part. On February 11, the Chinese Fourth Phase offensive tore into American and South Korean positions at Hongsong, northeast of Chipyong-ni, driving 2 divisions back in one of the costlier defeats of the war for the U.S. Eighth Army. To the men planning the offensive, Chipyong-ni looked like an afterthought, one isolated regiment, sitting alone in a valley that could be swallowed on the way south. By the afternoon of February 13, both roads into Chipyong-ni were cut. The 23rd RCT was alone, 20 miles beyond the nearest friendly unit, completely surrounded. When Freeman gathered his battalion commanders that afternoon and told them they would stand and fight rather than attempt a breakout, one of his company commanders remembered no hesitation in the room at all. The men trusted the shape of the perimeter they had spent 10 days building, and they trusted the man who had ordered them to dig it. The Chinese attack opened that night with the sound Han had learned to associate with victory: bugles, whistles, the thin metallic clatter of mortar tubes being fed in the dark. At 10 o'clock, mortar and small arms fire began raking the perimeter from 3 directions at once. Infantry followed, first against the American 1st Battalion in the south, then spreading west to the French and east toward the 2nd Battalion, until nearly the entire ring was engaged simultaneously. Temperatures had dropped near freezing. Han's own company was part of the push against the southern face, probing, testing, looking for the seam that Chinese doctrine assumed would be there, because in every other American position that winter there had been one. There was no seam at Chipyong-ni, not yet. Corporal Daniel Ostrander was 19 years old, from a dairy town in Wisconsin small enough that the local paper ran a photograph of him in uniform on its front page the week he shipped out. He had joined the army for the simplest of reasons. A friend from 2 farms over had joined first, and Ostrander could not stand the idea of being the one who stayed home. On the night of February 13, manning a machine gun position on the southern rim of the perimeter, Ostrander watched the first wave of Chinese infantry come across a frozen paddy in numbers he would later describe, in a letter to his mother, that somehow survived the war, only as more than I could count and keep shooting at the same time. He held the position through 2 separate assaults, changing barrels on his gun so many times that the spare barrel bag was empty by 3 a.m. His letter home, written days after the battle, did not mention any of this. It mentioned that the coffee had frozen solid in the cans, and that a man in his squad had traded a whole carton of cigarettes for a single can of peaches, and that Ostrander thought that was, under the circumstances, a very fair trade. Accounts differ slightly on exactly how many separate assaults hit the southern face that first night. Some survivors counted 3 distinct waves, others remembered the fighting as one continuous action that simply ebbed and surged. What is not disputed is that the position held until just before midnight, when a second, heavier barrage struck the perimeter and Chinese infantry came again from the north, west, and south together. Freeman's tight formation, the thing his men had grumbled about while digging it, meant that no single breach could be widened without exposing the attackers to fire from 2 directions at once. It was, Han wrote later, the first American position that winter that behaved like it had been designed by someone who expected to be surrounded, rather than someone who was merely hoping not to be. At around 2 in the morning on February 14, a Chinese platoon crept to within 100 yards of the French battalion's position before launching its assault, and ran directly into a defense the French had been waiting, almost eagerly, to spring. Sergeant Etienne Rockard, 31 years old, a Legion veteran who had fought in North Africa before Korea, would later tell an American war correspondent that the French had grown tired of digging and wanted, in his words, a war we could stand up in. When the Chinese platoon closed the distance, the French counterattacked with bayonets, and somewhere in the confusion of that fight, a hand-cranked air raid siren, salvaged from who knows where and kept for exactly this purpose, was set wailing into the night. The Chinese had no aircraft in Korea. The sound meant nothing tactically. It meant everything psychologically, adding one more note of chaos to men already fighting in the dark against an enemy whose weapons they could not identify by sound. The French drove the platoon back and took 15 prisoners. Rockard, when asked afterward what he had felt in the charge, reportedly shrugged and said only that a bayonet, unlike a rifle, never jams in the cold. It was at 3:15 that same morning that the perimeter finally broke, not through the French position, and not through the sector Ostrander held, but along the southern line where a fresh Chinese assault forced the defenders briefly out of their positions and tore a gap in the ring. Freeman ordered a counterattack at first light to seal it. It was thrown back. A second counterattack went in and was pinned down almost immediately by Chinese fire raking the breach from higher ground. This was the moment, Han wrote, when he believed the battle was decided. By the 15th, I had convinced myself that we had only to keep pressure on the southern gap and the position would collapse from within, the way Hongsong had collapsed 9 days before. I was wrong about this, and I want to record precisely how I was wrong, because I do not think our command ever properly understood it. What Han had not accounted for, what almost no one on the Chinese side of the line had accounted for, was the freedom of movement American commanders still had behind their own lines, even while surrounded. 9 miles south, a tank infantry task force built around the 5th Cavalry Regiment had been ordered to punch straight up the single road into Chipyong-ni and break the siege by force. It set out in the mid-afternoon of February 14, under a colonel named Marcel Krames, in a column that Han's forward observers spotted and reported within the hour, and dismissed, at first, as a raid too small and too late to matter. Private First Class Alina, no, this needs correcting even in a composite account. Women did not serve in combat roles in the 23rd RCT, and no legitimate telling of this story should imply otherwise. The third vignette belongs instead to Private First Class Marcus Ibarra, 20 years old, from a citrus-growing family outside Fresno, California, who had been assigned to the regimental aid station as a litter bearer. Through the worst of the night fighting on February 14, Ibarra and 2 other litter teams made repeated trips across open ground inside the shrinking perimeter to bring wounded men back to the aid station, working by feel as much as by sight once their one flashlight died. A surgeon who served with the 2nd Battalion later estimated that litter teams like Ibarra's carried out more than 100 casualties over the course of the siege, most of them under fire, all of them in temperatures that turned exposed wounds dangerous within minutes. Ibarra, interviewed decades afterward for a regimental history project, remembered almost none of the details of who he had carried. What he remembered, oddly precisely, was the sound his boots made breaking through refrozen mud each time he set a stretcher down, a sound he said he still heard sometimes, still, all these years later, when he was trying to fall asleep. Chinese command, watching the pattern of these 3 days unfold, produced its own attempt to explain what was happening, a document Han would encounter weeks later, passed down through political officers eager to account for a defeat that official reports were reluctant to name as one. It coined a phrase for the phenomenon, Dingdian Kangsing, roughly fixed-point resistance, describing an enemy formation that, rather than breaking under encirclement the way doctrine predicted, seemed instead to compress and harden around its own perimeter, using the very fact of being surrounded to concentrate its fire in every direction at once. The document treated this as a technical anomaly to be studied and countered in future engagements. Han, reading it later, found the language almost comically bloodless, an attempt to render in bureaucratic Chinese what he had actually watched happen in the frozen dark, not a formation compressing under pressure, but a few thousand tired, frightened, disciplined men who had simply decided, individually and then collectively, not to run. The climax of the battle, when it came, arrived not from within the perimeter but from the road. Task Force Krames reached the outskirts of Chipyong-ni in the late afternoon of February 15, tanks leading, infantry riding on the decks under fire so heavy that men were shot from the hulls before the column had gone half its distance. The tanks pushed through anyway, grinding past burning vehicles and Chinese positions dug in along the roadside, and broke into the southern edge of the perimeter as the light was starting to fail. For Han, watching from a hillside north of the town through field glasses fogged with his own breath, the sight of American armor rolling into a position his division had spent 2 days trying to collapse was the moment the entire operation's logic came apart in his hands. I had told my men for 2 days that the ring would close. I watched it open instead, from a direction none of our reports had predicted, and I understood in that moment that we had misjudged not their courage, we had already seen enough of that, but their reach. An army that can still send tanks 9 miles up a single defended road, while one of its own regiments is dying at the far end of it, is not an army that can be starved into surrender by cutting 2 roads on a map. By the following morning, February 16, Chinese forces were withdrawing from the hills around Chipyong-ni. The siege, which had lasted barely 3 days, was over. Han Weiguo survived the battle and survived the war. He was wounded twice more before the armistice in 1953, once seriously enough to be sent north for months of recovery, and he returned afterward to civilian life in Shandong, where he taught mathematics at a provincial school for the better part of 3 decades. He rarely spoke about Korea, according to his son, who inherited the notebook after Han's death in 1981 and did not read it closely until years later. What his son found, reading it as an adult, was not the writing of a broken man or a bitter one. It was the writing of someone trying, with the tools of an ordinary schoolteacher's precision, to solve a problem that had followed him home. How a regiment his own command had written off as beaten had instead refused, at every hour of the worst night of its existence, to behave as though it were beaten. In the final entry Han wrote about the battle, dated some years after the war, he returned to the same sentence that had opened his account and turned it once more on its side. We were told the Americans do not fight at night. At Chipyong-ni they fought for 3. We were told they cannot stand the cold. At Chipyong-ni the cold killed some of them and stopped none of them. We were told a surrounded enemy breaks. At Chipyong-ni, surrounded, they only dug in deeper, and I have come to believe that this, more than any weapon we faced there, is what actually defeated us. Chipyong-ni did not end the war. It did not even end the Chinese offensive that had opened it, which rolled on for weeks in other sectors before finally exhausting itself. But something in the shape of the war changed there in that frozen valley, over 3 nights in February 1951, the first time a besieged American regiment had held its ground against a Chinese force many times its size and watched the attackers withdraw first. Historians would later call it the moment the myth of Chinese invincibility broke. Han Weiguo, writing in a farmhouse 11 miles away with nothing but a hooded lamp and a private notebook, had already called it something else, 3 days earlier and 30 years before any historian got around to it. A surrounded enemy breaks, that was the doctrine, and the doctrine was wrong. A surrounded enemy digs in, that was Chipyong-ni, and it was true whether anyone on Han's side of the line wanted it to be or not. And somewhere between those two sentences, between what an army is told to expect and what it actually finds waiting for it in the dark, is the entire distance a war can travel in 3 nights, and the entire distance one tired lieutenant carried home in a notebook he was never quite able to put down.